"Do not touch that switch," Vanessa Whitmore screamed as she stepped between the EPA officer and the fountain controls. Behind her, Crown Falls blasted 40-foot columns of water above 200 residents, local television cameras, and a red ribbon the mayor had not even cut yet. The officer raised a red enforcement notice. "Ma'am, this system is being supplied by an unauthorized water diversion." Vanessa pointed across the crowd at me. "He sabotaged us." I stood near the back in muddy work boots, holding the water rights certificate she had called worthless. I did not argue. The fountain operator lowered the switch. The pumps groaned beneath the reflecting pool. The towering jets lost pressure, bent sideways, and collapsed into the water. Then the officer locked the control box beneath a bright red federal seal. Vanessa had spent $1.2 million on that fountain. She had cut my chain, used a false easement, and drained the creek my father had protected for more than 30 years. What she did not know was that my cameras had recorded the pipe, the pump, and the order she gave after receiving a formal legal warning. 3 weeks earlier, I woke up and realized Alder Creek had gone silent. Alder Creek ran through 22 acres my family had owned since long before Silvercrest existed. It was not a river. Most people driving past probably would not have noticed it, but it fed a line of wetlands, 2 cattle ponds downstream, and a narrow strip of hardwoods my father had protected for more than 30 years. My name is Daniel Mercer. I spent 26 years maintaining municipal water systems, pumps, pressure lines, flow meters, backflow controls. I knew how water behaved, how equipment failed, and how quickly a small change in pressure could damage an entire system. After my father died, I left the city and moved back into the small house he had built above the creek. Every morning, I checked the metal measuring gauge he had bolted into a limestone shelf beside the water. That Tuesday, the creek was 8 inches below its normal summer level. We had received nearly 2 inches of rain 3 days earlier. The water should have been high. Instead, several pools along the bank were turning into mud, and the sound of moving water had nearly disappeared. Then I heard something else. A steady mechanical hum was coming from beyond the trees, in the direction of Silvercrest. I followed the creek upstream and found fresh tire tracks, broken branches, and a strip of straw spread over newly disturbed ground. When I pulled the straw aside, I found a black industrial pipe buried beneath it. The pipe was vibrating. Water was moving through it, away from my creek and directly toward the HOA's new $1 million fountain. The pipe led toward Crown Falls, the centerpiece of Silvercrest's newest expansion. Vanessa Whitmore had spent months promoting it as a symbol of luxury. It included a massive reflecting pool, programmable lights, and 40-foot water jets synchronized to music. The HOA claimed the project cost $1.2 million. More importantly, it sat directly in front of 12 unfinished Lakeview homes the developer still needed to sell. I drove to the clubhouse and found Vanessa standing beside the construction fence with Grant Whitmore, the project contractor, and her brother-in-law. I asked one question. "Why is there a pipe running from my creek to your fountain?" Vanessa did not look surprised. She adjusted her sunglasses and said Alder Creek was part of a shared community watershed. According to her, the HOA had the right to use it during drought conditions to protect landscaping and property values. "The intake is on my land," I said. She looked at my old truck, my work shirt, and the mud on my boots. "You own a cabin and some weeds," she replied. "We are protecting 200 homes." Then she handed me a violation notice. It accused me of interfering with emergency drought infrastructure and threatened daily fines if I blocked the pipe. I checked the parcel number at the top. It was not mine. My land had never belonged to Silvercrest. Vanessa was not only stealing water. She was creating paperwork designed to make me look like the trespasser. I did not touch the pipe. If I removed it, Vanessa could claim I had destroyed HOA property. Instead, I photographed everything, marked the intake location, and locked the service trail leading to the creek. I added 2 new signs. Private property. No trespassing. The next morning, my phone alerted me to movement. On the camera feed, Grant's crew stopped outside my gate. One worker looked directly at the sign. Another pulled bolt cutters from the truck. They cut my chain, drove an excavator onto my land, and dragged a larger pump toward the creek. By the time I reached them, Vanessa was already on the phone with the sheriff's department. She told the responding deputy I had threatened her workers and was interfering with critical HOA infrastructure. I stayed 10 feet away from everyone and opened the files on my phone. The deputy watched the video of Grant's crew cutting my lock. Then he compared the county parcel map with the location of the pump. Vanessa opened a leather folder and produced what she called a historic water management easement. According to her, my father had given Silvercrest permanent access to the creek. The deputy said no one was being arrested. He ordered both sides not to alter the site until the county records could be checked. As soon as his vehicle disappeared, Vanessa turned to Grant. "Keep the pump running," she said. "We are maintaining the system, not changing it." I looked again at the date beneath my father's signature. The document had supposedly been signed 14 months after he died. I spent the rest of that day in my father's old office. He had kept every deed, survey, tax record, and utility agreement in labeled folders inside a steel cabinet. By midnight, I had found the original water rights certificate, the recorded property map, and every legal easement attached to the land. None of them mentioned Silvercrest. The document Vanessa had shown the deputy had 3 problems. First, the recording number did not exist in the county database. Second, the parcel number belonged to an abandoned lot almost 2 miles away. Third, the signature date was 14 months after my father's funeral. I placed Vanessa's copy beside one of my father's real contracts. The handwriting was not even close. The next morning, the county recorder confirmed there was no historic water management easement registered against my property. But inside the same cabinet, I found something else. It was a 20-year-old environmental survey prepared by Dr. Maya Ortiz. The survey documented a protected salamander population living in the shallow pools along Alder Creek. It warned that sudden changes in water level or sediment could destroy their breeding habitat. That changed the situation. Vanessa was not only taking water from private land. Her crew had dug through the creek bank, lowered the water level, and pushed fresh mud downstream. To prove how much damage they had caused, I needed current measurements. So I stopped thinking like an angry property owner. I started thinking like a water system technician. I built the case the same way I used to diagnose a failing water system, one measurement at a time. I divided a binder into 6 sections: ownership, water flow, trespass, environmental damage, HOA communications, financial records. Then I installed 2 more cameras on my property and began checking the creek every morning and evening. I photographed the water gauge, recorded the sound of the pump, measured the pipe diameter, and zoomed in on the serial number attached to Grant's equipment. Using the pump model, pipe size, and estimated operating pressure, I calculated that the HOA was pulling tens of thousands of gallons from Alder Creek every day. The numbers matched what I could see. Every time Silvercrest posted another photograph of Crown Falls filling with clear water, the pools beside my property dropped lower. The following night, one of my cameras captured Vanessa and Grant near the intake after midnight. Grant moved several large landscaping stones while Vanessa held a flashlight. Together, they covered the exposed pipe and buried the pump connection beneath fresh mulch. I saved the video to my computer, an external drive, and my attorney's secure folder. I did not need to accuse Vanessa of hiding anything. I had her on camera doing it. The next morning, I called Dr. Maya Ortiz. the scientist who had surveyed Alder Creek with my father 20 years earlier. Maya arrived that afternoon with sampling bottles, a field camera, and the same weathered clipboard she had used with my father. She spent 2 hours moving slowly along the creek. The damage was worse than it looked from the bank. Several shallow breeding pools had nearly dried out. Fresh sediment covered the gravel downstream, and muddy water was moving through a narrow channel Grant's crew had cut beside the intake. Maya found salamander eggs attached beneath a half-submerged branch. Some were already exposed to the air. She photographed every location, recorded the coordinates, and collected water samples above and below the construction area. "I can document what changed," she said. "The agencies will decide what laws apply." That mattered. I did not need a dramatic accusation. I needed a clean record showing what the creek looked like before the pump, what it looked like now, and exactly where the disturbance began. Maya's preliminary readings showed sediment levels several times higher below the trench. The HOA had not simply placed a pipe on private land. Its crew had disturbed the creek bank and created a path for soil and construction debris to enter a connected downstream channel. That gave us two separate issues: unauthorized water diversion and environmental damage. Before filing formal complaints, my attorney gave Vanessa one opportunity to stop. His cease and desist letter was delivered to her at 10:08 the next morning. It included the recorded deed, the valid water rights certificate, the county's confirmation that no easement existed, and Maya's preliminary findings. The letter demanded that the HOA stop pumping immediately, preserve every contract and email connected to Crown Falls, and stay off my property. Vanessa signed for it herself. At 10:36, one of my cameras recorded her walking toward the intake with Grant. She still had the envelope in her hand. Grant looked at the falling water level and warned her that continuous pumping could pull mud into the system. He suggested shutting everything down until the permits were reviewed. Vanessa unfolded the letter, glanced at it, and said, "Run it continuously until the grand opening. We will deal with the paperwork afterward." Grant asked whether the event should be postponed. "The fountain only has to look perfect for one morning," she replied. That sentence changed everything. Until then, Vanessa could have claimed she misunderstood the property line or trusted a bad document. Now she had received formal notice and ordered the operation to continue anyway. I saved the recording and sent copies to my attorney. That evening, an email arrived from an address I did not recognize. It contained only one sentence: "You are looking at the water. You need to look at the money." The anonymous sender was Susan Bell, Silvercrest's assistant treasurer. She asked to meet at a diner 2 towns away, where no board member would recognize her. Susan placed a flash drive on the table. "The fountain is leaking," she said. An engineering report showed that Crown Falls had developed cracks beneath its reflecting pool. It was losing thousands of gallons every day. The city had already refused Vanessa's request for additional water because of summer restrictions. Delaying the opening would have forced the developer to disclose the defect to potential buyers. 12 luxury homes were still waiting to close. Vanessa's solution was the hidden pipe from Alder Creek. Susan showed me invoices for what Grant called a temporary watershed replenishment system. The board had never approved it. Then she opened the financial records. $186,000 had been transferred from Silvercrest's emergency fire reserve to Grant's company. Grant was not only Vanessa's contractor, he was her brother-in-law. Vanessa also stood to receive a 6-figure sales bonus if the remaining homes closed before the end of the month. The final email removed any doubt. "Once the remaining homes close," Vanessa had written, "we can restore the reserve quietly." She had not stolen my water to protect 200 families. She had stolen it to hide a defective fountain long enough to sell 12 houses. By then, I had evidence involving property rights, environmental damage, false records, and HOA money. But no single agency controlled all four. My attorney warned me not to send one enormous complaint and expect one office to solve everything. So we divided the evidence into 4 separate packages. The county received the deed, property survey, footage of Grant's crew cutting my chain, and proof that the supposed easement had never been recorded. The State Water Authority received my father's water rights certificate, decades of flow records, the pump specifications, and my daily measurements showing when Alder Creek began dropping. The Wildlife Agency received Maya's photographs, sample results, and the coordinates of the damaged breeding pools. The EPA received images of the trench, sediment readings, evidence of the connected downstream channel, and the video showing Vanessa continuing the operation after formal notice. I did not call anyone a criminal. I listed dates, locations, measurements, parcel numbers, and the names of everyone present. 2 days later, EPA compliance specialist Rachel Kim called me. She asked whether the pump was still operating. Yes, I said. Do not shut it down yourself, she replied. Do not confront the contractor. Preserve the site exactly as it is. Then she asked when the system would be running at maximum capacity. Friday morning, I told her. During their grand opening. There was a pause. We will need to see it operating, she said. The night before the grand opening, Vanessa called an emergency HOA meeting. Nearly every chair in the clubhouse was filled. A photograph of me standing beside the creek appeared on the projector behind her. Underneath it were the words, "Threat to community property values." Vanessa told the residents I was an anti-development extremist, trying to hold 200 families hostage over a narrow stream. She claimed every permit had been approved, the water easement was valid, and no HOA funds had been misused. Then she gave me 3 minutes to respond. I walked to the microphone carrying 1 sheet of paper. I did not accuse her of fraud. I asked 3 questions. What county recording number belongs to your easement? Vanessa said the HOA attorney had it. When did the board vote to hire Grant's company? She said emergency projects did not require a public vote. And why did the Emergency Fire Reserve pay for a decorative fountain? Vanessa reached across the table and turned off my microphone. Several residents shouted at me to leave, but the board treasurer looked directly at Susan. Vanessa leaned toward the microphone. Everything connected to Crown Falls is legal, approved, and fully documented. That statement went into the official meeting record. By trying to humiliate me publicly, Vanessa had attached her name to every false document, hidden payment, and unauthorized decision in the case. After the meeting, the HOA attorney handed me a letter threatening a lawsuit if anything disrupted the grand opening. I folded it carefully and added it to my file. The pump ran harder than I had ever heard it that night. From my porch, the motor sounded like a truck idling beneath the trees. I checked the creek gauge at 9:10, 11:40, and again just after 2 in the morning. Each time, the level had fallen. My camera showed Grant standing beside the intake with a flashlight. The pump is pulling sediment, he told Vanessa. If we keep this pressure, the fountain nozzles could clog. Vanessa did not tell him to stop. She ordered him to lower the intake, cover the exposed pipe with landscaping stones, and remove every visible trace of the trench before the guests arrived. No inspector sees this tomorrow, she said. Maya called shortly after midnight. Her preliminary results showed sediment downstream had risen far beyond the normal range. Then Susan sent me a photograph of Vanessa's prepared speech. One line described Crown Falls as an environmentally responsible symbol of community stewardship. At 6:17 the next morning, an email arrived from Rachel Kim. Our team will enter through your property at 8:45. Do not alert the association. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was scheduled for 9 o'clock. Vanessa only needed the fountain to survive another 15 minutes. I stood beside Alder Creek as the pump continued pulling water through the hidden pipe. Then, just beyond the trees, I heard the first government vehicle turn onto my road. By 8:30, Silvercrest looked less like a neighborhood and more like a resort launch. A string quartet played beside the clubhouse. Servers carried champagne between rows of white chairs. Local reporters positioned their cameras in front of Crown Falls while a drone circled above the 40-foot water jets. Vanessa stood on stage in a cream-colored suit, holding an oversized pair of ceremonial scissors. I stayed near the back of the crowd in my work shirt and muddy boots. When Vanessa noticed me, she smiled into the microphone. "Some people resist progress," she said. "Silvercrest moves forward anyway." The crowd applauded. At 8:45, Rachel Kim and the inspection team entered through my property. They photographed the intake, checked the pump model, collected a water sample, and followed the buried pipe toward Silvercrest. A few minutes later, 3 government vehicles turned through the HOA entrance. The applause faded. Rachel walked toward the fountain with a state water officer, the county surveyor, and a wildlife investigator. Vanessa stepped off the stage before they reached the control panel. "You cannot interrupt a private event without an appointment," she said. Rachel displayed her identification. "We are not here for the event. We are here to inspect the active diversion and sediment discharge feeding this fountain." Phones rose throughout the crowd. Vanessa pointed toward Grant. "The contractor handles the water system." Grant looked at her but said nothing. Then Vanessa opened the same leather folder she had shown the deputy. "The HOA has a permanent easement," she announced. "Every permit was approved, and we never received any warning that this project violated anything." Rachel looked past her toward me. My attorney stepped forward carrying the delivery receipt, the county records, and the video file Vanessa had never expected anyone else to see. Rachel asked Vanessa to identify the legal source of the fountain's water. Vanessa held up the easement. "This document gives Silvercrest permanent access to Alder Creek." The county surveyor opened a map on his tablet. "No, it does not," he said. He enlarged the property boundaries for everyone standing nearby. "The intake is located 112 feet inside Mr. Mercer's parcel. The pipe crosses 2 recorded boundary markers, and there is no water easement attached to this property." Vanessa turned toward Grant. "You told me it was recorded." Grant stared at the ground. My attorney handed the surveyor the document Vanessa had been using. "The recording number is invalid," he said. "The parcel number belongs to land 2 miles away." Then he pointed to the signature date. "My client's father supposedly signed this 14 months after his death." The board attorney took the document from Vanessa's hand. For the first time that morning, she had nothing to say. Rachel moved to the environmental evidence. Maya placed photographs on the registration table. They showed the creek before construction, the exposed breeding pools, the sediment below the trench, and the hidden intake surrounded by fresh landscaping stones. The wildlife investigator confirmed that the disturbed area included protected habitat. Rachel explained that this was no longer only a private property dispute. The crew had altered the creek bank, discharged sediment into a connected downstream channel, and continued operating the system while the damage was still occurring. Vanessa raised her voice. "No one ever notified me of any violation." My attorney held up the delivery receipt. "You signed for the notice at 10:08 on Tuesday morning." Then he played the camera recording. Vanessa's voice came through clearly over the speaker. "Run it continuously until the grand opening. We will deal with the paperwork afterward." No one in the crowd moved. Vanessa pointed at Grant. He controlled the equipment. This was his decision. Grant finally looked up. "I told her the permits were not approved," he said. "I told her the pump was pulling sediment. She said the houses had to close first." Susan stepped out of the crowd carrying a folder. She handed the board attorney the engineering report showing that Crown Falls was leaking thousands of gallons each day. Behind it were Grant's invoices, the unauthorized transfer from the emergency fire reserve, and Vanessa's email promising to replace the money after the final homes sold. The board treasurer read the first page, then looked at Vanessa. "You took $186,000 from the fire reserve without a vote." Vanessa reached for the microphone. "This project protects every homeowner in Silvercrest. You cannot punish 200 families over one creek." I spoke before she could continue. "You did not take that water for 200 families. You took it to hide a leaking fountain long enough to sell 12 houses." Rachel turned to the fountain operator. "Shut down the system." Vanessa stepped in front of the control box. "This is $1 million private community asset." Rachel held up the enforcement order. "It is currently being supplied by an unauthorized diversion. Turn it off." The operator lowered the switch. The pumps groaned beneath the reflecting pool. The 40-foot jets lost pressure, bent sideways, and collapsed into the water. The music continued for several awkward seconds before someone unplugged the speakers. Rachel placed a federal seal across the control panel. The state water officer ordered the HOA to stop pumping, preserve the equipment, stabilize the damaged creek bank, and submit a supervised restoration plan. Phones recorded every word. The board called an emergency vote on the spot. Vanessa was suspended as president before the red ribbon had even been cut. She stood alone beside the silent fountain, still holding the ceremonial scissors, while a bright red notice swung from the locked control box. Unauthorized water diversion. Do not operate. Crown Falls remained silent for the next 4 months. Under agency supervision, Grant's crew removed the hidden pipe, stabilized the damaged creek bank, and restored the channel they had cut through the wet ground. The contractor's bond covered part of the work. Silvercrest's developer was forced to return the money transferred from the emergency fire reserve. The new HOA board filed claims against Vanessa and Grant's company rather than passing the entire cost to the residents. Vanessa faced separate investigations involving the false easement, undisclosed family contracts, and unauthorized use of HOA funds. But the part that mattered most to me happened upstream. After the first heavy rain of fall, Alder Creek began filling its old pools again. Maya returned with her field equipment. Near the same branch where we had found exposed eggs, she discovered fresh salamander tracks in the mud. The water was recovering. Silvercrest's new board held an open meeting and formally acknowledged that my property had never belonged to the HOA. They adopted public bidding rules, required the disclosure of family relationships, and placed every major contract online for residents to review. They also apologized, not through an attorney, in person. Crown Falls was eventually rebuilt as a smaller, closed-loop system using captured rainwater. Part of the reflecting pool was replaced with native plants and a shallow wetland garden. The new sign did not carry Vanessa's name. It read, Alder Creek Restoration Garden. One morning I walked down to the limestone shelf where my father had installed his old measuring gauge. The water had reached the same mark he recorded in his final notebook. Vanessa had spent more than $1 million trying to manufacture the sound of water. My father had taught me that real water did not belong to the person with the loudest microphone, the largest fountain, or the most impressive title. It followed the land. It followed the law. And eventually, it followed the truth. Crown Falls stayed silent for months. Alder Creek did not. That was the lesson Vanessa never understood. A title, a clipboard, and $1 million project do not give anyone the right to take what belongs to someone else. Real authority leaves a record. So does every lie. What would you have done if an HOA buried a pipe on your land and stole your water? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe for more stories where quiet homeowners let the evidence do the talking.